Hi, I'm Marty Kelsey, one of the hosts of STEM in 30, an Emmy-nominated TV show for middle school students produced by the National Air and Space Museum. And welcome to the Air and Space Live Chat. We have a great show for you today. This month, we are focusing on National History Day. The most recent episode of STEM in 30 came out about 2 weeks ago and introduces you to some amazing people and how important communication is to them. This includes athletes, authors, and historical figures. We'll put a link down in the comments section. Be sure to check that out. Before we get going today, remember that we want to know where you're watching from. And if you're with a class, let us know your teacher's name and we'll give some shout outs throughout the show. Also, this program is for you. We want to know what questions you have for our experts. We want to focus on communication, but any questions that you have, put them down in the comments section and we will try to get through as many of them as we can today. So for today, we have Dr. Peter Jakab, Senior Curator at the National Air and Space Museum, who focuses on early aviation, including the Wright brothers, and Dr. Heather Wilson, an Air Force veteran who served as the 24th Secretary of the Air Force, representing New Mexico's 1st District in Congress, and is currently the president of the University of Texas, El Paso. Thank you both for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
All right, we're going to jump right into things. Peter, the Wright brothers had different ways of approaching a problem. Can you explain what made them a good team and how important communication was to solving their problems?
Well, you know, we often talk about the Wright brothers, and it's almost as if they're one person. But of course, they were brothers, and like most siblings, they were different people, had different personalities, brought different things to the work that they were doing. And one of the things that was characteristic about the way they worked together was they loved spirited debate. They were really good at arguing different points of view to come to a solution. Wilbur used to say about his brother Orville, he used to say that Orv is a great scrapper. I just love to scrap with Orville. And sometimes they would argue a point so strenuously that they would come out on the other side from where they started. But those spirited discussions often led them to a great idea or solving a problem that they were struggling with.
All right, Heather, you were accepted to the United States Air Force Academy as part of the 3rd class that accepted women. Tell us how important communication was for you in both your military career and your political career.
Well, one of the most important things about communication isn't the talking, it's the listening. And as a member of Congress, there's no substitute for getting out in town hall meetings and in neighborhood associations and doing a lot of listening. And I find that as a leader even today at the University of Texas at El Paso, you really have to have your ears on, particularly in a difficult situation like the pandemic. But I learned a lot about communication and leadership at the Air Force Academy, and I was really blessed to have been able to go there.
All right, well, we've got folks watching from all across the country: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Georgia. Homeschoolers are tuning in. California, New Mexico, India, North Carolina, the Netherlands, London, South Africa. So not only around the country, but around the world. Don't forget, if you've got questions for our guests, put them down in the comments section, and we will get to as many of them as we can today. All right, let's see. Peter, can you talk to us a little bit about how the museum objects can communicate with us today?
Well, one of the things that's unique about the museum setting and learning is the objects, and these are the real things that you get to see. And one of the things that's impressive about our collection is so many of the things we have are one of a kind or the only example, and you can only see them at the Smithsonian and coming to the museum or going to our website. So these objects are very special. And I think when you look at an object, sometimes it really stimulates stories. It stimulates an emotional response to the story that perhaps isn't as strong when you're reading about it on the page of a book or reading it on a website. So the object really, it's a real tangible element of the historical event that we're talking about. And in the case of something like the Wright brothers airplane, which is such an important object, so much of our modern world stems from the Wright flyer, you really can get a powerful understanding of history by engaging with the object in an intimate way.
Awesome. Let's see. We've got more people tuning in from all across the country, including Ohio and the Philippines, Virginia Beach, and Nebraska, all checking in. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Again, let us know where you're watching from, and we'll give you a shout out. And then we've got more questions coming in. The next one I want to ask, Heather, tell us about your family history and how that influenced you going into the Air Force.
Yeah, my grandfather started flying shortly after the Wright brothers. He flew for Scotland in the First World War. He was one of the first pilots after the RAF, the Royal Air Force, was formed. And then he came to America after the war because there was no work in Scotland, and he was a barnstormer in New England. And he opened up airfields and gave rides to people and things. And then in the Second World War, so that's my grandfather. That picture there is him in training in World War I. And then in the Second World War, they needed some courier pilots, and then so he became a courier pilot, which was the predecessor to the Civil Air Patrol. So he was one of the founders of the Civil Air Patrol, and he used little airplanes to fly parts around to different bases and things. And you're talking about communications. Of course, there were no radios in his airplane in World War I, and even in World War II, the first airplane he had as a courier pilot had no radio, so he couldn't talk to the tower when he was coming into an airfield. And I remember him telling me the story that he finally figured out that he needed to talk to these guys or he was going to get in trouble. So he got a couple of civilian radios that were left over from when Grenier Field was a civilian field, and he rigged it up in the tower so that the radio didn't go very far, but they could see him coming. And when they saw him coming, they'd turn on that little civilian radio so that he could tell them that he was coming into land and talk to him. So So my grandfather was a real inspiration to me. My father was also a flyer and was a mechanic in the Air Force and then was a commercial pilot. So I grew up around aviators, and my dad actually taught my mom to fly, and they built an airplane together.
That's amazing. I love the family history there. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Peter, I think this is a really interesting question for you. We know the Wright brothers had the first airplane. What was the second airplane?
Well, the second airplane was also the Wright brothers airplane. Of course, we have the famous airplane that made the historic first flights in 1903, the airplane we call the Wright Flyer. But the Wright brothers weren't finished then. To them, that was just sort of a proof of concept machine. Their goal was to build an airplane that they called a machine of practical utility, or an airplane that could stay in the air as long as the fuel supply lasts and was under the full control of a pilot, a practical airplane. And they experimented further with a second airplane in 1904, and then a third one in 1905. And it was that third one in 1905 where they were really able to have a true airplane. And their best flight in 1905 lasted nearly 40 minutes, and it was quite a significant achievement. So their experimental airplanes in 1903, 1904, 1905 were really the first airplanes, the 1903 being the first one to truly fly, and then the 1905 being the first practical airplane.
And on that very famous first flight, they could pretty much communicate with each other just by waving and yelling because it wasn't going that fast, right?
Well, the first airplane was a pretty hairy airplane to fly. It was pretty unstable, so it was kind of all hands, all feet, all mind. It wasn't the case where Orville was just, flying along and saying, "Hey, Wilbur, look at this." It was a pretty intense experience to fly a Wright airplane.
And it was 1908 when they sold the Wright Flyer to then the Army, I think that there's a replica of it at the Air Force Museum out in Dayton. And one of the fascinating things to me, and you were talking about how you see objects and they tell you things, is the controls that they used were from bicycle parts. So they had a bicycle chain to warp the wings, and you look at that and you think these were bicycle mechanics. They weren't aeronautical engineers in the way that we think of them today. They were tinkerers. They were bicycle mechanics, and the heritage of the Air Force goes back. We're still really in some ways a bunch of bicycle mechanics.
Well, you mentioned the bicycle, and one of the things that I love about the Wright Brothers Gallery at the museum now is that when you walk in, there's a bicycle. One of the first things you see, and if you don't know the story, it's a little weird to see a bicycle there. But learning how, when you walk into a museum, the way that artifacts are laid out and the way that you walk through tells this story. And I always think that's a really powerful thing. And as a teacher, I never thought about that a whole lot. So learning at the museum how curators communicate with the public through the way that they lay out artifacts and the stories they tell has been really interesting for me over the last couple of years. So I encourage our viewers, the next time you go to a museum, and that might be a little while, think about that as you walk through. Think about what stories are they trying to tell me and why, because there's always something behind that. All right, we've got more questions coming in. Peter, what materials did the Wright brothers use to make their airplane? And then Heather, I'm going to follow that up with you about the materials that are used today.
Well, the airplane was made of wood, mainly spruce and ash. It was a wooden frame, and it was covered with a muslin fabric to put the skin on the airplane, and then it was braced with steel wires. So that was the typical construction of airplanes for a number of years into the future. And of course, modern home-built airplanes still have wooden fabric construction, that sort of thing. But the thing about the Wright brothers, I would respectfully disagree with my co-presenter here. They really weren't tinkerers. They really were consummate engineers. And one of the things that is really important to understand about the Wright brothers is they didn't just create an airplane that got off the ground. They really invented aeronautical engineering in a fundamental way. And we still design airplanes fundamentally the same way the Wright brothers designed that very first airplane. And I like to say that if Wilbur and Orville walked into a modern aeronautical engineering laboratory today, they would not be entirely confused. Obviously, there are things that are new and different and more complex. But in terms of the basic understanding of how airplanes fly and how we design them, we still do it the way the Wright brothers pioneered it in 1903. So when we think about what the Wright brothers achieved, it wasn't just creating a piece of hardware. It was really coming up with the way that we think about engineering and designing of airplanes.
Well, to call someone a tinkerer is a compliment from me, but they also created a wind tunnel to test their models, which of course we still use wind tunnels to test aircraft. But aircraft today are made of a whole variety of materials. And in fact, when you think about what's different today in aerospace compared to 100 years ago, one of the biggest things is the changes in materials. So in the Second World War, aluminum aircraft was a major modernization, and of course now you can do it with composite materials and carbon fibers and mixtures of materials. And here at the University of Texas at El Paso, we actually have a center that does three-dimensional printing of materials. So we can instead of taking a material like a piece of metal and bending it, we actually build it up from powder, atom by atom. And when you do that, you both don't have as much waste. You can design much more intricate details in 3 dimensions, and you can embed electronics inside of the material. So material science is one of the things that's really advanced aviation.
That's so exciting. And you know, a year or so ago, we did an entire episode of STEM in 30 about bees. And you wouldn't think bees have a great connection with aerospace, but they do. If you've taken a commercial flight, you've been surrounded by honeycomb type materials.
Yep.
And so if you're interested in the materials that airplanes are made out of, be sure to check that out. We've got a lot of folks tuning in: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania checking in 3 times, California, Louisiana, the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, Arkansas, North Carolina, New York, Kansas, Missouri. Then we go to the Netherlands, United Kingdom, South Africa, India, and Mexico. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to tune in today, and let us know what questions you have down in the comments section. Peter, somebody is asking us about, do we have any aircraft in our collection from the Tuskegee Airmen?
We don't have any that were in our collection from the Tuskegee Airmen, but we do have an airplane in the Smithsonian at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. There's a Stearman training airplane from World War II that particular one was actually used by the Tuskegee Airmen. So there is one in the Smithsonian, but not at the Air and Space Museum.
All right. We have a question for Secretary Wilson, and this is a long question, so bear with me.
Okay.
How much of the romantic imagery of the World War I pilots as knights of the air who engaged in chivalrous and individual combat square with the reality of your grandfather's experience as a Royal Flying Corps pilot in the Great War? And did he fly the Sopwith Camel?
He did not fly the Sopwith Camel. He flew a DH-7 and a DH-9, and he did sub-search over the Irish Sea. And he told me all kinds of stories, but one of them is that the aircraft were wooden fabric aircraft, but their engines were lubricated with castor oil. But there was a ring at the top of the engine. The oil only went through the engine once, and then the oil would come out the top of the engine and soak all of the fabric all the way down to the ring roots. And these weren't very reliable airplanes, so you had to land in cow fields quite frequently if you lost an engine or something. And he said that the cows dearly loved that castor oil. And so the most important thing if you had an emergency landing was to get your airplane away from the cows so they didn't eat away your wings. So there were parts of it that didn't seem, to me as a kid, they seemed really funny, but they weren't always, daring knights of the air. He also said that he, in the Second World War, when he did sub-search off of the Atlantic coast looking for submarines, that he wasn't really sure what he was supposed to do if he saw one. He'd probably go back and tell them where it was, but they were kind of afraid of the airplanes overhead, so they kind of scare him away a little. So it wasn't all that dramatic, I guess.
Peter, you've actually had an experience flying an airplane like that. Can you tell us what that was like?
Yes, I've had the opportunity to fly a World War I biplane, a 1916 Sopwith 1.5 strutter with a rotary engine. And that was probably the most exciting flying experience of my life. And one of the things about those early airplanes is things don't happen terribly quickly. For example, when you're making a turn in an airplane like that, you turn the controls to move the stick to turn, and you wait a little bit, and you wait a little bit, and you wait a little bit, and then it starts to turn. But then you've already got to start correcting and coming back the other way while it's turning to the right. You got to start turning it back to the left to sort of catch up with it so it doesn't go too far and you can get stable. So I'm sure those who fly modern military jets with the great precision of their craft, flying a World War I biplane with a rotary engine is a very different sort of experience.
And can you tell us a little bit? We've got a new World War I gallery coming into the museum. Can you tell us about it?
Well, it's going to feature a number of aircraft that are in our collection that are really special. You mentioned the Sopwith Camel. We very recently, only a couple of years ago, acquired a beautiful example of a Sopwith Camel. There's only about half a dozen that still exist in the world, and we have probably the finest example now in our collection. So that's going to be the centerpiece of the gallery. And one of the things that we're really going to try to show is that the flying experience was very, very different at that time. And even by World War II, flying was much more like it is now than it was at that time, because you're in an enclosed cockpit and all of that. But in World War I, you're out in the elements. We talked about the castor oil, which is spraying on the pilot, the danger of fire because of the unreliable engines, and all of those sorts of dangers were really, really quite a different kind of flying experience. And very, very quickly, within 20 years, we had a much more modern experience where you were in an enclosed cockpit with more reliable engines and all of that. So World War I, pilots who flew in World War I really were living a pretty precarious existence.
All right, we've got more folks tuning in from around the country. Arizona.
Yeah, the other thing that...
Oh, go ahead. Oh, I think we lost Heather there for a second. We'll come back to her. We've got Arizona tuning in, homeschoolers in Alabama, Wisconsin, homeschool teacher in Georgia, Nevada, and Houston all tuning in. Peter, somebody wants to know about the original Wright flyer. Wasn't it destroyed in wind on the day of the first flight?
Well, they flew it only on one day, December 17th, 1903. And they made 4 flights that day in the morning. And the last flight, the 4th flight, was the best one, almost a minute in duration and 852 feet long. So that really proved that they truly had an airplane that flew. And then they were going to have some lunch and then fly some more in the afternoon. But as the airplane was sitting on the ground, a gust of wind came across the sand dunes where they were flying and turned it over and cartwheeled it and damaged it beyond repair in the field, but didn't destroy it. It was just too damaged to repair it out in the sand dune there. And of course, they had achieved what they had wanted. The weather was closing in, and so they packed it up and returned home to Dayton, Ohio with it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 1904, they built a second one, an improved one, and again in 1905. But the Wright Flyer only flew on that one day, but it certainly did make those first historic flights.
And Peter, I know a question that we get a lot at the museum, and I just want to put this to rest. When you walk into the museum, or if you've ever been to the museum and you walk in the Wright gallery, that's the one.
That's the actual airplane that the Wright brothers made those first flights. One of my favorite quotes about any of our objects, when the airplane was given to the Smithsonian, it didn't come to the Smithsonian until 1948. But when it was installed and put on public view, the British ambassador was on hand because it had been on loan to the United Kingdom for a number of years before coming to the Smithsonian. And he said, it's a little bit as if we have the original wheel before us. And I think that's really a powerful way to sum up the importance of this object, that it's really everything in aviation flows from this one object. Every modern airplane, every airplane that you fly on today has the same controls, has the same basic aerodynamic principles. Everything stems from that original Wright brothers airplane. And that's part of what separated the Wright brothers from other experimenters. They weren't interested in just simply getting a thing that got off the ground so they could take credit for having made the first flight. They wanted to create something that could evolve into a practical machine, and that could ultimately carry passengers, carry a payload, and of course evolve into what we have today. So when you stand there and you see that object, it's the real thing, and also everything around it stems from that object. It's really a powerful thing to be in front of.
It is. As Secretary of the Air Force, how much did you look at the past to influence what was going on today?
Well, actually, we did a lot. In my office, we had, I asked them to bring in objects. We have every aircraft that's ever been flown by the Air Force, we keep one copy of. And we have all kinds of technology and innovation that I used to display in my office. Everything from, I actually had a piece of some of the fabric from the Wright workshop on my wall, and some other things from space. And it was just, we used that inspiration. And in fact, when we decided we needed to really change the way the Air Force buys aircraft, we looked back to what are called the Century series, the F-100, F-101, F-103, F-105, F-104, where they very rapidly innovated, where you connect the operators very closely to those who are doing the research, just like the Wrights were. So you don't have these 15-year development cycles. You're doing it very quickly, and then iterating and getting better and better as you test. And it's really from our history that we change the way the Air Force buys airplanes.
Awesome. Well, we've got a few more minutes, so if you've got questions, be sure to put them down in the comments section. Peter, we've got a question coming in about Catherine Wright. Can you tell us a little bit about her story and how important she was to the success of the Wright brothers?
Sure. Well, we know about Wilbur and Orville Wright, but in fact, there were two older Wright brothers, Rushlin and Lauren Wright, who went off and did their own thing. And then there was the younger sister, Catherine, who was 3 years younger than Orville and was very close to her brothers. And in fact, Catherine is the only member of the Wright family who graduated from college, and she became a teacher. And so she was a professional woman and very much ahead of her time in a lot of ways. She didn't contribute anything really technically to the creation of the airplane, but when the Wright brothers were off at Kitty Hawk doing their experimentation, she was helping to run the bicycle shop back home, and she managed the affairs of the brothers when they were away. But perhaps the most important thing about the Wright brothers family, their sister as well as their father and other brothers, was that they really provided a very supportive environment. Think about this now. You have two bicycle mechanics who weren't college graduates, and they were going to take on this project that many well-known people were trying to work on and weren't being successful. So there was a little bit of audacity in their effort to try to invent the airplane. And but their family environment was such that they had a lot of self-confidence, and they had a very supportive family environment. So their sister was a critical player in creating that family environment that was as much a part of their success as their technical ability.
Awesome. And Heather, you're on the Women in Aviation board, and Beth is a member of that. Can you tell us about the work that you're doing there and why it's so important?
Sure. There aren't enough girls who think about becoming aviators, and not just flyers. It's mechanics, and there's a whole aerospace industry out there that is exciting, and creates good opportunities for girls and women. And not enough girls think about exploring that, and as a result, we're not taking advantage of all of the talent in this country or in the world. Fewer than 10% of licensed pilots are women, and fewer than 5% of mechanics are women. But women make great pilots, and they make great mechanics. And so we are trying to look at ways to open the doors for opportunities for girls to join the aviation industry.
Awesome. And if you're interested in that, check out the FAA. Check out the FAA Facebook page. You can find a lot more information about it there. And we'll post a link down in the comments section. Peter, somebody wants to know, are the repairs to the flyer readily visible? And is it the original fabric?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the airplane was damaged on the ground when they made their last flight. And then it actually went through a flood. There was a great flood in Dayton in 1913, and it sat in the water for a couple of weeks in its crate. So it took a little wear and tear. And it was prepared for public display for the first time in 1916, 13 years after it flew. Actually at MIT, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It went on its first public display. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it was in the United Kingdom. It was in Britain for about 20 years on loan at the Science Museum there. The brothers had replaced the fabric for that presentation in the late 1920s. Then it came back to the United States and was at the Smithsonian beginning in 1948. And then in the early to mid 1980s, about 1983, 84, the Air and Space Museum did some conservation work on it, and we replaced the fabric for a second time at that point. So what you see today is largely the original wood, original framework, and most of the engine components, but the fabric that's on it dates from the 1980s. However, we do have a large piece of the original fabric from 1903 that was on the airplane when it flew, and that's on public display with the airplane.
Awesome. All right. We've got El Paso, Texas, Missouri, and A&P students from Texas all tuning in. Thank you all so much. Again, we've got a few minutes left, so put those questions down in the comments. We've got a homeschool teacher from Georgia watching, and they would like to know from each of you, what's the most interesting fact or story of aviation that you have that you know? Heather, we'll start with you. What's the coolest thing that you know about?
Well, there's some cool things that I got to know about as Secretary of the Air Force that I can't tell you, but here's, and this has to do with communication as well. The blue dot on your phone, some people think that comes from the cell phone company. It doesn't. It comes from the United States Air Force and the Space Force that runs 30, I think it's 33 or 35 GPS positioning satellites that circle the globe. And if you could see far enough and you could see 3 of those satellites at any one time, they're just giving off a very weak radio signal. And if you do the math with those radio signals, you can find the place on the Earth where you're standing with your cell phone. So that blue dot on the phone comes from about 40 airmen and guardians up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, who run the GPS system of satellites for the world. And you think about how that's changed, how communication has changed aviation. My grandfather didn't even have a radio in his little airplane that he could use to courier pilot parts around in World War II. And now in my little airplane, I've got a couple of things. I have a GPS receiver receiver right on my dashboard on my airplane. That one that's the colored screen there, that's a GPS receiver just on a little Cessna 152. And then on my iPad, there's a company called ForeFlight that tracks all airplanes now in the sky from something that's, you know, the next generation of identification. It's called ADS-B, but you kind of have to have them now, even on little airplanes. And so you can look on your iPad and see where all the airplanes are. It is just amazing what technology has brought to us. And to me, that's one of the more exciting things in aviation.
Awesome. Peter, what's your favorite story?
Well, you know, obviously, my world is historic objects, and of course, we have many thousands of amazing one-of-a-kind objects at the Smithsonian at the Air and Space Museum. But one of the ones I think that's among the most powerful is we have a little piece of fabric and a little piece of wood taken from the Wright brothers airplane in 1903 that Neil Armstrong took to the moon in 1969 when Apollo 11 made the first landing on the moon and the first time humans walked on the moon. There was a little bit of the Wright Flyer with Neil Armstrong on the moon. And that's such a powerful object to see because if you think about it, Wright brothers flew in 1903. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in 1969. So just 66 years from that first little 12-second flight by the Wright brothers to sending humans to the moon and flying to the moon, just in one human lifetime. So it really is an object that represents just how fast and how quickly and how amazing the story of aviation and space flight has been.
If you think about that, all of NASA at the time that got a man to the moon had less computing power than you have in your cell phone in your pocket.
And I often think about my grandmother who lived from the time when horse and buggy was how she got around when she was young. She saw the space shuttle launch, you know, and I think about that in that one lifetime is absolutely amazing. Heather, before the show started, you showed me something that you've got with you there, a logbook. Can you show us that and tell us a little bit about that?
So when I know the theme of the history is we're talking about communication. We've talked a little about radio and about GPS and navigation, but one of the other things that pilots do is they always keep track of their flights. And this is actually my grandfather's logbook, and you see it says down here, Flight Cadet RAF. A cadet G.G. Wilson, George G. Wilson, and this is his logbook from World War I. And it's just amazing to me that we continue to communicate with the FAA or with our instructors, or keep track of our time in logbooks, much the way they did in the early days of aviation. And when I was looking through here once, I noticed that on Armistice Day, on the 11th of November, 1918, my grandfather went on a flight. It's amazing to have these kinds of objects.
That's amazing. Peter, that's a great example of a primary source. Can you tell us how important primary sources are in your research as a historian?
Sure. Well, of course, as a historian, and as a museum curator in the museum, we're telling the stories, we're sharing the stories with our visitors and with our readers. But those stories are built from the original bits of evidence that the historical actors leave for us. So we have, in the case of the Wright brothers, for example, we have their notebooks and their laboratory books, and we can see what they actually wrote down and what they were thinking as they were developing their design. And it's using those what we call primary resources that are right from the hand of the historical actor that help us tell that story. And then historians like myself, we try to piece all this stuff together and create the story and try to help not only explain what happened, but also try to provide some understanding of what it means.
Awesome. Heather, we've got a question for you. How do you apply your aviation knowledge and experience in your role as the president of the university?
That's an interesting question. We actually are we are adding an aerospace program here and developing our ability to do advanced manufacturing in aerospace. So that's of personal interest to me. But I think it's one of the things about aviation and being a pilot is you have to always be learning. You can never say, well, I've mastered that and left that behind. And that's one of the things we try to inculcate with our students as well, is that that more than any other generation, this generation is going to have to always be learning. There's not going to be an end to it because the world is changing so quickly. And our conversation today really shows why.
Awesome. All right, we've got a homeschooler watching from New Jersey, and my 7-year-old wants to know, what is your favorite aircraft? His is the E-3 Sentry. So, Peter, let's start with you. What's your favorite aircraft?
Well, my 40 years as a museum person, people always ask that question, and I guess I'm always supposed to say the Wright brothers airplane because that's been one of my focus and written a lot about that. But I think what's again special about the Air and Space Museum is that we have so many one-of-a-kind things, and I'll do a little bit of a cop-out and say, well, I love the Wright Flyer. The Wright Flyer has been very good to me, but I just love our collection because not only is it one of the great aviation collections in the world, it's one of the great museum collections of any kind. So, and I'm from New Jersey, so I like that caller. But you got to come down from New Jersey to Washington and really see the wonderful objects we have at the Smithsonian.
Awesome. I have to say the Smithsonian is one of particularly Air and Space. You can just spend days there and not even taking part of it. My favorite airplane is actually the SR-71 Blackbird, and it is it was designed by Lockheed and Clarence Kelly Johnson, who was another, probably comparable to the Wright brothers in the amount of advanced engineering and what he did for aerospace. But it was it flew at Mach 3+. He also designed the U-2 at the Lockheed Skunk Works in California. So it's the SR-71, and they had to invent glass that could withstand enough heat to be able to have the pilots be able to look out of the SR-71.
It is always a stunning sight to walk into the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center and look over the balcony, and there's the SR-71 and the space shuttle behind it. Always amazing, and that really just kind of takes your breath away. Well, Peter and Heather, thank you both so much for joining us today. We are out of time. If you've been watching today, thank you for the great questions. We got to as many of them as we can. But before we leave you today, I want to share with you some additional resources that can help with your National History Day projects. You can search the National Air and Space Museum's archives collection using SOVA, the Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives. You can search the collections of personal papers, manuscripts, photographs, oral histories, film, works of art, and organizational records. And look for the blue icon that shows that it is a digitized record. You can also learn more about aircraft, spacecraft, equipment, art, memorabilia in the museum's collection by searching our artifacts. And for both of these, we'll add the links down in the comments section. We also want to remind you that we just released an entire episode of STEM in 30 on National History Day and the importance of communication. We do a kind of a deep dive into primary and secondary sources and introduce you to some really interesting people there. And on next Thursday, we will be having another National History Day chat. I can't tell you the topic yet. We're still working to lock that one in, but that will be next Thursday at 1 o'clock. Be sure to follow STEM in 30 on Facebook and Twitter for updates as we get them. Again, Peter and Heather, thank you so much for the great conversation today. And for all the students watching, good luck with your National History Day projects.